It's so good to see you all. I wish you all the happiest possible new year. And to say how wonderful it is that we've found this home just right across the street from the museum. Thanks to all who worked so hard to arrange that. It was touch and go for a while where we would land actually during this portion of the course. So in this lecture, what I wanted to do actually was pick up on a theme that I left you with in the lecture that I gave at the very beginning of the first half of this course. And to do that, I wanted to return to, at the beginning of the fall series, I was talking to you about Marco Polo because I thought he really seemed to stand in for the entire theme that we were going to pick up for this entire year, in fact, and that is the idea of objects on the move, moving from one part of Asia to another and even beyond. So with that in mind, I ended that talk with this image of the very famous sandalwood Buddha, this auspicious image of a Buddha who is purported to be an original portrait of the Buddha Shakyamuni that was taken by artists, sculptors who were sent to the heaven of 33 when the Buddha was visiting his deceased mother to preach to her. And the king of Udayana, who missed him dreadfully, deputized 33 sculptors to go to the heaven and to carve the sandalwood statue. So that statue had a remarkable career, and one of the things that struck me, and the reason I ended with this image in our at the beginning of fall, was simply because in the inscription, as it's translated in the catalog for the Latter Days of the Law exhibition, which was held at the Asian Art Museum in 1994, the part of the inscription, let's see if I can get this to move forward again. Part of the inscription actually alludes to Marco Polo, or so the translation said. It's in this moment when we read in the inscription, in the 12th year of the Juryuan era of Emperor Shurzu of the Yuan dynasty, that is in 1275, and this Emperor Shurzu is none other than Kublai Khan, the great official Boalaw, so this is what it actually says in the inscription, and his entourage, accompanied by Buddhist monks and musicians, offered the image to the throne, and it was kept in the Renju Dian for the next 15 years, so within the Forbidden City, in other words. So in the translation that was offered in the Latter Days of the Law catalog, this name, Boalaw, was translated as Polo, with the assumption that it was indeed Marco Polo who had access to this statue, who discovered it, and who presented it to Kublai Khan. Well, as I pointed out to you in the early fall last year, in fact, we now know that this Boalaw was a great Mongol official. But interestingly, he may be a Mongol official who knew Marco Polo. So I was wondering at that point whether Marco Polo's name, as it was rendered in Chinese or Mongolian for that matter, during the Yuan dynasty, may have been something very different from what we would have assumed. In any case, in thinking about this, I thought this would be an interesting kickoff point because none of the images that are classified as auspicious in the Buddhist world are anything but active in terms of how they've moved around the world. And primarily this image, the auspicious image of the sandalwood Buddha, is one that seems to create a kind of model for how we can think about how images move, how they become famous, how they indeed replicate themselves, or dare I say, reproduce themselves. Indeed, they seem to take on almost a kind of biological function at a certain point as their fame grows, spawning copy after copy after copy. And like any biological function, as time goes on, these copies move a bit by bit away from the original. So what we're looking at here, as you see, is a rubbing of a stele that was commissioned in 1597 by a monk named Shaoqian, who came from the far western province of Sichuan. And this was erected at the monastery in Beijing, the Qing capital, or rather Ming capital at the time, the northern capital, where the sandalwood image was kept. And it's important to note that this image, as the long inscription that surrounds it carefully details, had an immensely long and storied career. It literally details every move it made from after its arrival down the long staircase from the heaven of 33, where it greeted the king of Udayana, the commissioner of the image, and later greeted the Buddha when he returned from heaven, to its miraculous appearance in Central Asia, specifically in Khotan, and then its flight from there to China. In fact, this story really is only known in China and Tibet. So it's and Japan, of course. So we have a kind of a movement of the story probably from Central Asia into China at a very early date, and then ultimately on to Japan in the 10th century. And then in the end, arising as an important story, but with certain twists in Tibet as well. So the question of what the implications of this might be, I think in terms of art history, has really to do with the form that the Buddha takes. In the 1597 rubbing that we were just looking at, we see the classic form of the Udayana Buddha, or sandalwood auspicious image, that is a standing figure with one hand raised in abhaya mudra, making a gesture of greeting, and the other hand lowered in a gesture of boon giving or the giving of benefits. It's pretty clear that this form is a form that traveled very early across Asia to come to China in all sorts of replicas, whether or not these images were ever considered to be the sandalwood Buddha. They were the primary form that was received by the Chinese and ultimately throughout the rest of East Asia. So I'm showing you just some prototypes, and I think you're all very familiar with these. A standing Buddha of the Gupta period on the right, from India dating to about the 5th century, where we already see some of the characteristic marks of the drapery. You know, the story goes that the Udayana Buddha was crafted by the sculptors in heaven, where the Buddha actually agreed to pose for his portrait, but as it turned out, he was extremely radiant, and so the unfortunate sculptors couldn't really see him too clearly. They couldn't look at him directly. And so the Buddha kindly sidled up to a flowing stream in heaven, and he allowed them to see his reflection, thus mitigating some of the burning aspects of his body. And so the story goes then further that that's why we have this rippling drapery that appears on images of this type. That's reflecting really the mediating effect of this running water. So it's not a direct image, in other words. It's a heavily mediated image, even though it claims to be an actual portrait. And you can see already, I think in formal terms, the Gupta period Buddha has the same aspect. So this is the type that traveled across Asia, and as we see in the image on the left, the one in the Metropolitan Museum that's well known, I think, to all of you, dating to 496. This is a rather large-scale sculpture in bronze. It's inscribed as Maitreya, but it has all the forms, the types and aspects and points of the Gupta model that probably inspired it. So the inspiration was fairly quick to move along. So we might ask ourselves how this movement actually occurred, and let's just go back. So this is a little jumpy. Okay, did I miss something? Yes, I did. I am sorry. Just to go back to our first slide for a second, this is my fault. I just had it set up incorrectly. I wanted to say that I think the primary movement, and this is something you heard from Osman Boparachi last fall also, was probably via coins. In coins that were minted by the Kushan king Kanishka specifically, and by subsequent Kushani kings. This one in particular is interesting and has an inscription on it that literally reads Buddho, and you can see that the form of the Buddha that's depicted here is one that is really in line with what we come to know as the sandalwood auspicious image. Of course, here it's cast in gold, so it's quite a different kind of story. Now let me see if I can go back down again to where we were. As we know, this image became sought after by literally everyone, and it spent a great deal of time in China, arriving sometime in the 4th century in the hands of the great translator Kumarajiva, who brought it from Kucha in Central Asia, where he was a prince, and he becomes established, of course, as a famous translator in China. But the story also goes that he brought this image with him, and that the image flew with him from Central Asia to China, and then became an object that passed from the hands of one set of rulers to another. So very early on, well, literally from its inception, this image was connected with royalty and with imperial families. It was considered to be a kind of palladium, that is, a object that literally embodied the power of the Imperium. So it was an object of extreme interest to pilgrims who came to China, knowing about it. And one of the interesting stories, of course, is the story of the monk Chonin, who comes from Japan and China around the year 945, and who is intent upon obtaining the sandalwood Buddha, or at least a copy of it. So, there's this very complex story about what happened in that year, where Chonin commissions a copy of the sandalwood Buddha, which he wants to take back to Japan, and he presumably accomplishes this, and this indeed is the image that Chonin is said to have commissioned. However, in the middle of the night, right before departure, the story also goes, and this is one that is very interesting, is that the original sandalwood Buddha was switched with a copy so that the image that Chonin took back to Japan was the actual Udayana Buddha. Now, if that's the case, then stylistically it's very bizarre, because as you can see, it has certain characteristics that seem to place it really rather firmly in the Tang Dynasty, and specifically in this period of the immediate post-Tang Dynasty, I should say, in this period of the middle of the 10th century. And it has certain characteristics also that it picks up from earlier experiments that were done in Buddhist sculpture and iconography, essentially, under the reign of the Empress Wu Zetian at the end of the 7th and early 8th centuries. So let's take a look at one of the most peculiar aspects, and that is specifically the interesting spiral of hair on the head of the Buddha, which you can see here is something that seems to match very closely with some of the objects. In fact, one here, or I should say across the street, in the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. So this is a Buddha head from the period of Wu Zetian, from the Lei Gutai, or the thunder drum platform at Lungmen. This is on the far side of the site, and it's a site where the Empress Wu Zetian was very active and created a number of caves that were quite esoteric in their the way they're organized, and some of the figures are really revolutionary. So this is something that doesn't appear in earlier Buddha images. In other words, it doesn't seem to refer to any Indian model at all, but for some reason this spiral, this way of dressing the hair, emerges as a stylistic quirk sometime in the Tang period, especially under Wu Zetian, and then continues to be an important aspect of how the Buddha's hair is arranged later, particularly Buddhas of the Udayana type. So we can look at a much later image such as this one from the 18th century, that is a Qing dynasty court copy. By the 18th century, the Qing believed that they possessed the actual image of the sandalwood Buddha. They referred to it as the Jiao image, or reflected image. This Jiao, however, I think in Chinese we could translate as reflected or reflection. In other words, a reflection, thinking about this water flowing down the stream and the Buddha standing kindly next to it in order to have the sculptor's work on his portrait. We can think of it also, I think, as a transliteration of the Tibetan Jowo, which is the name, of course, of the primary image in Tibet, the precious Jowo Rinpoche. So this is a term that is really interesting, I think, in the 18th century in terms of how it probably was understood, how it was interpreted by those who actually used it. So this is a copy of the Jiao image. It's rather smaller than the original is purported to be. It's probably about 3/4 life size. And it is unusual in that it is actually carved out of sandalwood. So unlike a lot of other copies of this image, this one is in the authentic material. Many of them are not, including an example made for the Qianlong Emperor's mother, which was made out of bronze. So it seems as though the material didn't matter in terms of this reproductive quality. As I was saying, I think the image is not really stable as a form, except for its posture and it's the mudras it offers. For the rest of it, it seems to be really actively keeping up to date, staying modern in a sense. That is to say, staying approachable by people, contemporary people who come to see it and to pay it homage. So I've shown you these images in the past before, but I just wanted to bring them back because, the story of this sandalwood Buddha, the actual one that fell ultimately into the hands of the Qing emperors, is a convoluted one. At the end of the dynasty, during the Boxer Rebellion, the story goes that the image was snatched from the temple where it was kept in Beijing, and it was simply spirited away. Some people believe it might have been lost in a subsequent fire in the temple. So there are all these terrible stories that swirl around it. But a few years ago, a scholar from Czechoslovakia located this image, which is now in a Gita monastery in Buryatia. It's a rather large image in sandalwood, as it turns out, and it's claimed to be the true sandalwood Zhou or Jiao or reflection image that was formerly at the Hongren Monastery in Beijing. So there's a big question surrounding this, obviously. Is this the real thing, the actual portrait of the Buddha? It looks very 18th century, obviously. And you see it also crowns in this image on the right, which is, it's the state that it's usually presented in. So the fact of its crowning is an interesting point because we know that in the late Ming period, the Empress Li, who was the Wanli Emperor's mother, a very devout Buddhist, ordered that the sandalwood Buddha be given a crown and ornaments. So in other words, with this aspect being added, some important transformation took place. Now, as far as this image is concerned, we also know that the story goes that, in fact, the image was removed from the Hongren temple and it was placed on a sled and it was hauled in the winter months up to Mongolia, where it was kept quietly in hiding, and ultimately moved to Buryatia. So they've solidified the story, in other words, about how this image continued to move. But the fact is that this image continued to transform itself and move from the very earliest periods. With the addition of the crown, I think we confront an important, I would say, ontological problem. And that is the problem of what is the status of this image? Is it a real portrait of the Buddha as he appeared as a person? Or is it supposed to give us some other aspect of his being? That is this a transformation from the so-called Nirmanakaya or emanation body, the body that the Buddha would assume during his last life, and one of many that he assumed over the course of his many incarnations, that ordinary humans would see? In other words, is this the Buddha as he appeared on earth? Or are we being given access to a different aspect of the Buddha, that is his Sambhogakaya, or his body of enjoyment, where he would appear with complete regalia, with a crown and jewels similar to those worn by a bodhisattva. So this is a very exclusive view, in other words, one that I think is privileged, in other words, that somehow the Wanli Emperor's mother really wanted everyone to get access to. We can see that this crown that was given in the latter years of the Ming Dynasty really catches on among a lot of Buddhists who were enthralled by the Udayana or sandalwood auspicious image. In Mongolia in particular, dozens and hundreds probably of replicas were made, and there's a wonderful article by Isabelle Charleux on this subject of the replicas that were made in Mongolia. Almost all of them are crowned, as you see here. So clearly what's being represented is what a pilgrim would have seen if he or she visited Beijing and went to the Hongren Temple and was able to venerate this Buddha. So it's presented as here in this copy as it was presented in the temple. That is, with all of the other aspects of it, the parts that aren't actually carved in which would include the body and the robe, but the crown and the gems which are added on as acts of veneration are included as part of the sculpture. So this is an interesting problem. Are we looking at an image of an image, in other words, that's making a real attempt to say, this is what the sandalwood Buddha looks like when you visit Beijing? So it's a kind of souvenir. Or is it saying, this is the sandalwood Buddha. This is how he should appear before your eyes. So again, I say that this is an important thing to consider, and I'm going to return to this problem at the end of today's talk because I think it's one that we really should be thinking about throughout this lecture today. So I'm just showing you here a prayer to the sandalwood Buddha, which is in the Tibetan language, but was produced in Mongolia in the 18th century, so it's a rather late image. But I think that this is one that probably is intended to represent the image of the sandalwood Buddha as enshrined in the Hongren Temple in Beijing, because you can see the lamps and offering cups in the front of the Buddha all lined up, and the shrine setting right around him, and he is shown as crowned. So in the period of the 18th century, this image changes from this presentation to this presentation, where at the Yonghgung in Beijing, for example, artists painted it without the kind of elaborate gems, but still you can see a rather modest crown and the jewels, the beads that court officials actually wore in the Qing period. But in the other image on the right, unfortunately we believe now lost, but which was apparently a very large-scale painting of this image, you see him unadorned. So he's presented simply as he would have been presented. So one of the images that I really love best for thinking about the Udayana Buddha and his status is this one, which is very hard to see because I was attempting to take it from a beautiful book that we have in the library at Berkeley, which is this book, a woodblock print book called Swan Snow's A Preordained Life, that dates to the middle of the 1840s. And it purports to be, it's a record, a travelogue of a man named Lin Qing, who was a Manchu official, who traveled all around China. And he did this beautiful travelogue where he, basically on one page, he describes what he's seen and what his day was like, and tries to put in little bits of history, so he provides context for what's up. And on the other side, there is a beautiful woodblock print done in extremely fine line, which we're totally not able to capture here because the paper it's printed on is so thin that when you try to scan it, oddly, it was in the part of the stacks where you could just take it out. It's a very old book. It really should be in the rare book room, but it isn't. So I was able to spend a lot of time with it, I have to say. It's very refined in terms of the way it's carved. So what we're looking at here is the moment where Lin Qing arrives in Beijing with his goal being to examine the sandalwood Buddha at the Hongren Temple. So he goes there and he visits it. And he has a wonderful text that describes the history of sculpture from the Yuan period forward. He actually has a very compact, it's about, it's simply one page, but he gets a lot in. So he's naming a lot of famous sculptors. And then he points to this image as an image that he had long wanted to see. So what we see here in this picture, on the left in the pavilion that's moving at somewhat of a diagonal, you can see Lin Qing, who's seated on the floor, looking very attentive. And I just want to point out one thing that I just love about this, is that right here, can you see that black dot? That's a gecko. So I think it's supposed to indicate something about he's in the real world, essentially. You know how fast geckos are? So this is supposed to be that one moment when the clouds part, as you can see them doing in this woodblock print, and reveal the image to him, the image of the sandalwood Buddha, who's shown enshrined here in a way similar to what we saw in the Mongolian woodblock print of the 18th century. So here you see that the Buddha is presented with a rather modest crown, but presumably this is the one that was given to him by the Empress Li of the Ming Dynasty, with coral offerings on either side. And you see he's standing on a lotus pedestal. There are offerings set out on the table before him. So it basically replicates the setup that we saw in the Mongolian print. What we're seeing here, I think, is intended, I believe, by Lin Qing. I may be over-determining this, but the fact is that I think what we're looking at is something where Lin Qing is actually experiencing a revelation of some sort, that it's not just that he's finally gotten to see this famous image, but that this image has appeared before him, in a sense, in a true form. So to my mind, this really suggests something about the nature of the crowning and what it was meant to do. That is simply to present a form of the Buddha that takes it up to a different level of understanding and viewability or visibility. Who can see this, in other words? Who has the background and the training and the meditative depth to understand the importance of this image as communicating something true about the Buddha? So these things, I think, are what I'd like to continue thinking about, because I think the business of authenticity was always a desperate concern for Buddhists far from the Indian homeland of the Buddha, and how they assured themselves of the authenticity of objects was always a crucial question. So that's what I'd like to talk about a bit today. To go back in time, I think that this issue of authenticity actually really reaches a peak of concern and creates massive anxiety in the Tang Dynasty, which is interesting because, as you know, in the Tang Dynasty, China was in really close contact with the rest of the world. And in fact, it's the period when the monk Xuanzang was able to travel to India and bring back incredible amounts of information. And also, what we know, drawings of some of the images he saw. He reported in great detail about the buildings he saw, and we'll return to this at the end. I just think that this is a moment of critical importance in terms of exchange. But interestingly, I think as this new flood of images came in from India during the Tang period, it caused Buddhists to begin to worry about the status of the images that they had been relying on all this time, which looked markedly different. My guess is that they just seemed very archaic or old-fashioned, somehow poorly made, not as beautifully fabricated as some of the new things that were arriving. So we see in the caves of Dunhuang, for example, a clear evidence, I think, that the image of the Buddha was subject to question, like, was it authentic? How can we determine what its origin is? Where did it come from? The whole issue of whether a copy could be taken as an authentic representation was really on the line. So I think we could say that in this period, the whole nature of representation was seriously a matter of concern for Buddhists. And here we're looking at cave 323, and I beg your pardon for these very small images, but this is one cave. It's so important, but they have never really published decent photographs of it, and it's not one of the caves that was beautifully photographed during the Mellon project a number of years ago. However, it's an important cave because in the upper registers on both the south and north walls, that is the left and right walls as you enter, there are stories of ancient arrivals of images to China. And I just wanted to show you a couple of these just to set up this concern, again, about where these things were coming from, when the first images actually arrived. There seems to be a real desire to put that as far back in time as possible. So some of the stories that I've highlighted with blue squares on the right, where we're looking at the wall on the north wall, which is on your right side as you enter. One of these stories is an interesting one that actually tells the story of the great general Zhang Qian heading to the western regions on behalf of the Han Emperor Wu, who reigned between 140 and 87 BCE. So this is part of a series, as I mentioned, of paintings that actually there are two stories that are incorporated in this one scene that are aligned, where in the bottom we see Zhang Qian on horseback. He's about to leave. There's an elaborate umbrella or a parasol over his head as he heads out into the desert to go and seek information about the western regions. And the Buddhist view in this period, specifically information about Buddhism and the so-called Golden Man, who later becomes such an important figure in the dream of the Emperor Ming in the second half of the Han Dynasty. So this is very early. We don't really have any evidence of any interest or knowledge of Buddhism during this period in China, archaeological or otherwise. So these are stories that really grew up, I think, out of this early, desire, in this case in the early Tang Dynasty, to somehow come to grips with how far back this history of Buddhism in China could be pushed. So that's one story. And in the upper right-hand side of that very image, you can see a shrine. And I don't know how well you can see it, but there are two standing images there of Buddhas. This is actually a quite different story that tells the tale also from the period of the Emperor Wu of the Western Han period, that describes a trip that the general Hu Qubing took to the western regions on behalf of the emperor. So you may know he was a great general, very famous for fighting against the Xiongnu, and died at a very early age, but was given the privilege of being buried next to the emperor. So I think the idea here is that if you're going to pick anybody that the emperor would task with such a delicate mission, it would be somebody like Hu Qubing. So he goes out and he returns with these two golden men, two standing images of the Buddha, who are shown here in the form that we expect from the sandalwood Buddha of the king Udayana. They're not so labeled. But the fact is that the story is one that emerges in this period of early tales, and which becomes an object of artistic, just interest, I think, in the early Tang period. And it continues. So the issue of famous images that somehow prove themselves to be either super authentic or, came in under certain determinable historical circumstances from the West that could really be pointed to as evidence of direct contact, not terribly mediated. All these things were of immense importance. So I'm going to show you this painting. I think we've looked at it before together. This is a really interesting work that was studied in some detail by Alexander Soper a long time ago in a wonderful article he did on it. It's a painting of famous images that are painted on silk that date to the 8th century, and it comes out of Dunhuang Cave 17, which is, of course, the library or manuscript cave. And as you know, the contents of that cave were split up and they were taken to all different places. But part of this painting, it was in very bad condition when it came out of the cave, and it literally fell into pieces, and the people who were looking at it as Oral Stein brought it first to Delhi to have conservators take a quick look at what he had brought back, divided it into two parts. So we have now one part that's in the British Museum and the other part that's in the National Museum in Delhi. So the black and white image is the Delhi portion, and the color image is an image that I was able to get from the International Dunhuang Project site, where you can find very beautiful high-resolution images from Dunhuang of the material that came out of Cave 17. So as you can see, this is an image. I've already labeled it to suggest that it is labeled. There are inscriptions on the fragments, some of them really readable, others not so readable, that allow us to identify what these scenes are. And what we can see is on the left in the colored portion that's in the British Museum, which I'll concentrate on, we have the miracle at Shravasti at the very top, where we have a standing Buddha. Then to his over to the left of that figure is the Buddha at Bodh Gaya, identified as the Buddha who came from the country of Magadha. That is this area where Bodh Gaya was located, as this follows really Xuanzang's report. That's exactly how he describes the site of the Buddha's enlightenment. There's also an image of the first sermon, it's so described, and an image in the center of the so-called Nagahara, or shadow image from Afghanistan, that Xuanzang also describes in great detail. There's a Guanyin that Xuanzang also described in the lower left, and the Buddha on the vulture peak on the lower right of the colored portion. And we have other stories, including Shakyamuni's triumph over heresy on the Delhi side, and the thief stealing the Buddha's head jewel. These are, the inscriptions are readable, but the others are either the inscription's lost or the image itself is lost. So I wanted to talk about a few of these, because I think they're incredibly interesting. Gives us some insight into, I think, how people were thinking about this. Now, in the slide I showed you, I didn't show you the fragment in the British Museum example, which I'm now amplifying because it just made it too small for the screen. But you can see at the very top on the upper left, there was a separate fragment that the conservators ultimately in the Stein collection have placed at the very top. And here you can see the same story of the golden men that we saw in Cave 323, dating to the late 7th or early 8th century. So these objects are pretty much contemporaneous, that is the cave and this painting on silk. So again, here they're identified specifically by inscription as figures brought back by Huichubing and brought into the Ganchuan Gung, or the Sweet Spring Palace in the Han Palace. So this was a very important location for them to wind up in. So some of the stories actually are ones that seem to be repeated, and I think these were extremely popular during this period of time of the late 7th and early 8th century, literally a half a century after Xuanzang arrived back from India. And so what he did was request the crafting of 108 more images of the Arya Lokeshvara. And these were made, presumably the original ones, in sandalwood as well. There are now literally hundreds of these Arya Lokeshvara images known from collections around the world. And I wanted to show you some of them to give you a sense of the range of possibility. What's interesting is that part of the story, has to do with these sandalwood trees that are willing to give themselves up to become images of Arya Lokeshvara and to participate in this plot of subduing the demoness and to nail her down with literally these trees' own bodies. So it's a major sacrifice that's being undertaken here to cure what we could see as faults in the landscape, I suppose you could say. So I'll show you some of these three here of the hundreds of extant copies of this particular form. And as you can see, this figure is shown as a young, elegantly shaped young man, crowned rather elaborately, a slight tilt to the hips, slightly Tribhanga pose, so it's not completely frontal, but almost. The hands usually reach out at a low level, as you see, to form the mudras. Some of them are elaborately enshrined and were at later stages in their existence, and that is certainly true of the one in the center from Sakya Nur in Nepal and in the Rietberg Museum. So there are lots of examples of these. And part of the effort, I think, around these images in Nepal and Tibet is their constant renewal. So as we were looking at the original Arya, just to go back here in the Potala, I think the same situation applies here that we see in the famous Zhouwo image of Princess Wenchang. That is, we look at it and we say, that can't possibly be a Tang Dynasty image, and probably it isn't. It's probably 15th century. But really thinking about it, it's been overlaid so much with, the care of regilding and fixing whatever flaws arise over time, the patching up, the kind of Botox that is used to bring the face back to a kind of, sense of youthfulness, because that image is supposed to be an image of the young Buddha, right? That all of this really turns the face into something different as time goes on. And in fact, at each moment, it's different from what it was before. We can see this also, I think, in this Kirung Lokeshvara from the Potala Palace in the center, who is looking very much like the Zhouwo image at the Jokang in Lhasa. The other two images in Nepal are even more altered by the careful care that's been given them, and I'm just going to go down and suggest that the bathing and dressing of these images is really part of how they're cared for and how their continued strength is assured, so that going forward, the demoness is not going to somehow slip her bounds and somehow ruin everything again and cause Tibet not to be a Buddhist country. So part of this is the idea of subjugation, of overcoming, a kind of violent story that really seems to fly in the face of the Buddhist message we've been trained since the past World War II to accept as the core of Buddhist practice. So here I think we're looking at, here we're looking at copies of either the Jambahadiya or the Bumkadiya. It's kind of hard to tell because the faces are so covered up. And as you see in the originals, likewise, this constant ritual attention to the face has turned them into more mask-like forms. That's how they actually appear. And the fact is that in these copies, that's been dutifully copied. In other words, to represent the true form of the Arya Lokeshvara, one needs to take into consideration all the reconstructive work that's been done on the face, basically taking into account the plastic surgery. So there's some very interesting aspect to this, that this somehow presents figures in their renewed form. They're shown in their form of having been paid attention to in a ritual sense that suggests something about their inherent power and their ability to create auspicious well-being for those who venerate them. So this figure also appears in other contexts, and one of the most interesting ones to my mind is in portraits of the Sakya Pandita, who is considered to be one of the pre-incarnations of the Panchen Lamas of Tibet. We find the Lokeshvara image appearing over and over again because apparently at one point in his career he had a quite successful debate in the presence of the Kirung Lokeshvara image. And so here you see the image, and I've just blown up a detail on the left where you can see the image enshrined with over to the near the right elbow of Sakya Pandita, who's basically sticking his elbow out. In case you missed the image, I think he really wants you to get a sense of the fact that a lot of the strength of his body posture may derive from this. So these images, the Arya images, were really, from the get-go, they were designed to be replicated because the trees gave up 4 images in total. 108 copies were made immediately and disseminated to nail down different parts of the demoness all around Tibet. And as time went on, these Arya figures proliferate. So here we get into, I think, a kind of sense of how these images could be seen as actually reproducing themselves in a way, simply by virtue of their own fame. So we hear about images that self-create, like the Fanha Buddha walking out of the cliff face, but there are also images that I would suggest, just through their own power, force a kind of constant chain of replication. So here's one very famous example, and I really love this one, that came to the Yonghe Gong in 1744 during the reign of the Qianlong Emperor. I think many of you know that the Yonghe Gong in Beijing, or the Yonghe Palace, which is now still a Tibetan-style Buddhist monastery occupied by monks from Mongolia and is a great tourist destination, is filled with images of all kinds. And this image was sent there when that site was transformed from the palace of Qianlong's youth, his father's princely palace, the Yongzheng Emperor's princely palace, to a monastery. So this was a typical practice in the Qing to take the previous emperor's princely dwelling and turn it into a monastery. So that's what happened in 1744. And at that time, the great Tibetan official Polonais decided to send a copy of the Arya Lokeshvara to the Yonghe Gong as a present. And it came, I think, probably just as the image, but it was rather elaborately augmented when it arrived at the Yonghe Gong. And in fact, we have very detailed records I managed to see from the Yonghe Gong requesting the creation of the halo, the aureole that you see behind the image. So it probably just came as a simple image, and then the aureole was crafted around it. Now I'm showing you 2 pictures of this in comparison with the original Arya over on the left in the Potala Palace, and you may wonder how this actually operates. In fact, in the crafting of this, the order that exists still at the Yonghe Palace specifically directs to the Imperial workshop that the halo should include a glass mirror, so as to reflect the back of the image when it was enshrined. So that's what we're looking at here. That's why it looks like the aureole is just hollow in the back. In fact, there's a mirror there. And when you turn it around, there's a really, really lengthy inscription. And here you can see the inscription written appropriately as in Qing court practice in 4 languages. So it's in Chinese, Tibetan, Mongolian, and Manchu. And it details the gift and the fact that it came from Polonais, the fact that it was given to honor the consecration of this palace as a monastery, and so on. So it goes on and on from here. And to describe this image as the Arya Pagpa, or Pagpa Lokeshvara, that is located in the Potala Palace, thereby creating a very interesting thread. I mean, it may seem all just normal behavior to do this, but in fact, behind Polonais and his idea was a crafty plan to supplant the Panchen Lamas in Qianlong's heart with the Dalai Lamas. So this reference to the Potala Palace, I think, is an important one that was part of the rationale for why he chose this gift. But with this, I think you see very clearly how the Arya Lakeshvara, reproduced now in sandalwood and then gilt, is moved as a reproduction across to the court, where it then went on to spawn numerous copies. And I'm just going to show you one that's now in the Pavilion of Raining Flowers in the Forbidden City. So the ability of these images to take on a kind of reputation of efficacy, in this case, this is one of the images that actually subjugated the demoness and allowed Tibet to become a Buddhist country. This story, I think, is really a riveting one, and it was certainly from the perspective of the Qing court, no doubt. So they treated the image with a great deal of respect, and that's, I think, implied in the fact that they copied it. It appears here in the Pavilion of Raining Flowers, which was the private meditation chapel of the Qianlong Emperor, so it had a great deal of importance. Now, the last example, and I hope I can get through what I have to say about this before we turn to questions, is the Mahabodhi temple itself as an object of replication and interest for Buddhists over time. Now, we all know that the Mahabodhi temple, or the great temple of Bodhi, or in the Enlightenment, that houses the Vajrasana, or diamond seat in Bodh Gaya, is the place where the Buddhas apparently achieved enlightenment. And so it's an incredibly important spot in terms of Buddhist just history and the way that the Buddha's life story was constructed. The Enlightenment is the primary episode in the 8 scenes of the Buddha's life, and so on. So it goes on and on. The question of when the temple, as you see it here, was actually erected over the spot where the Bodhi tree grew is still a big question. But John Guy, in the article that I've given you in the handout, has gone into great detail about the earliest written records about this temple and who saw it, who described it, how they described it. So we have a whole list of descriptions actually that go back to the 4th century, meaning that it must have existed at least by the 4th century as an architectural structure that somehow was intended to memorialize, to serve as a monument to the moment of the Buddha's enlightenment. So what you're seeing here, of course, is a modern reconstruction that actually improves upon the reconstruction done in 1881 by the British Archaeological Survey. And with a lot of input, I think, from other visitors who came as pilgrims to this site. Here, you're looking at a photograph of the Mahabodhi temple before the 1881 reconstruction, where you can see the really a devastated form that it was in at this point of years of neglect. And it then underwent a reconstruction that was archaeologically sound, or so it was understood at the time, at this moment of the birth of scientific archaeology. So we know a lot about the Mahabodhi temple, and there's a lot we don't know about it. But what we know is that it's the very form of it, this shikara form at the top, the tower-like form, which then provides a kind of looming presence next to the Bodhi tree and its subsequent offspring, which still, the offspring still present at the site. That this was known through models that pilgrims carried from Bodh Gaya when they went to visit and pay homage at this holy site and then took home to their native countries. We think that a lot of these models were made, they're usually about 20 centimeters or smaller, so they were quite portable. They're carved out of stone by and large, that they were made in the region right around Bodh Gaya by stone workers and sculptors there, and that they were carried all around. So that they provide a kind of evidence of the central feature of the temple as we now know it, and that is the very spot of the Vajrasana, or the diamond seat. That is the actual place where the Buddha went through this lengthy meditation and was able to defeat the forces of Mara and achieve enlightenment. So the models take on all kinds of forms, and there are literally dozens of them that are known. This one's in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, probably dates to the 12th century. Conservatively, it might go back as far as the 10th century, and carved as the others out of stone. But there are some that were found also in Tibet. This is a sandalwood model of the Mahabodhi with the detail of the Vajrasana you see right next to it in color, dating to the Ming Dynasty. We know that this is a Ming Dynasty creation and hasn't really been photographed as a whole model very well, but now we have at least this great detail from the center part. It has a Chinese inscription, that is the whole model does, that dates it precisely to the Yongle reign of 1403 to 1424. And for the longest time it was kept at the Nartang Monastery. This is where it was found by an archaeological survey mounted by the Chinese government in the 70s, I believe, who went and found the model, photographed it, and this is how it appeared in the archaeological journal where it was published in this kind of grainy black and white photo. So we know that somehow during the Yongle reign of the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese court knew about the Mahabodhi temple, that they had probably received images of it. And if they didn't know it from that form, they may well have known it from a very famous temple that many of you may have actually visited in Beijing, a temple which I think, tend to think of as dating to the Qianlong period because it was reconstructed at that time in 1748, but it was actually first constructed in 1331, that is during the Yuan or Mongol dynasty. This is the Biyun temple, or the Temple of Azure Clouds in the western hills of Beijing. And it's a great trip to go there because you can take that wonderful, that suspended, thing that you ride in a car high above it, and you can nearly, kill yourself by leaning out to get the best possible shot of it, nestled in the hills. So this wasn't taken from a plane, it's taken from that little ski lift type thing that they have. Yeah, that's it, thank you. I'm looking for words today for some reason. So this is one of the earliest full-scale models of the Mahabodhi that was made with the typical 5 pagoda structures around set on a terrace and with openings in the main tower in the center. It has a kind of mandala form, as you see. It's taken on very organized form. And in the area below, in the main tower, there's a spot where the Vajrasana is replicated and where an image of the Buddha also sits. So there are, so far as we know now, 6 copies of the Mahabodhi temple full scale that were made in China. And just to show you another one, because we have great historical photographs of it, this is the Zhenjue temple also in Beijing, constructed during the Ming Changhua reign in 1473 and subsequently restored during the Qianlong period. Again, this was a temple that the Qianlong emperor was extremely interested in. So you see it as it exists today, and you can see that the form gets kind of set in China with this really massive platform with a series of registers, each one with a niche within which an image of the Buddha is sitting in the classic pose of reaching enlightenment, that is Nabumi Shparsa Mudra, where he's reaching down to the ground with his right hand to touch the earth and call it to witness. So just to show you that this temple actually survived pretty well, here it is in 1870 in a photograph taken by the Scottish photographer John Thompson, who went there and did a whole series of photographs of it. There are quite a few from all sides and some wonderful details. There's a mad website that you can go to where all the historical photos of the Zhenjue temple appear. That's just fantastic. So here I think you can see the niches and how each one is occupied by a Buddha. Likewise, there was another temple that was created in Inner Mongolia. I'll just show you here that the Temple of the 5 Pagodas. I know years ago I went with a trip with the Society for Asian Art, back when I was curator at the Asian Art Museum, to Hohhot in Inner Mongolia, and I think some of you actually were on that trip and may remember us visiting this temple, which was created in between 1727 and 32 by a Mongol monk whose name was Yangkarchi. So this, again, seems to be modeled very much in a sort of series. We have the Mahabodhi temple somewhere at the center, the models that make their way across Asia. We have the establishment of the Biyun temple very early, then the Zhenjue temple, and this looks very much as though it's based on the Zhenjue temple. There are others as well that were established in southern China. Just to give you another view of this one in Hohhot, you can see here it's got a double terrace that's been built. So he's doing the Zhenjue Temple one better by raising it up yet another level to elevate its status. So there are at least two more of these Mahabodhi temples that were established in South China. And of course, we have the very famous example of the Mahabodhi temple in Pagan in what is now Myanmar, that really actually is a very important one because it was established quite early. And the back and forth of monks from Burma, which is attested to by inscriptions at the Bodh Gaya site now, really suggests that the present form of the Mahabodhi temple, especially the kind of interesting form of the niches, which start with a pointed top and come down, probably derives from some of the input that came from Burmese monks who were intent on creating this. So it's not just the temple itself that was replicated as a whole, as a site. So the whole thing picked up and replicated. So India being now inaccessible, there seemed to be a kind of urgency in the replication of these sites all across the Buddhist world. But also, even earlier, the image itself was being replicated. And I just wanted to, in the last part here, to suggest that these images were very, very early in date. In fact, here's one that dates probably to sometime in the 10th or 11th century, a clay plaque that shows the Buddha in this Vajrasana, in his moment of achieving enlightenment, the hand reaching down. It's a pala image, and it's a little image that could be easily transported. We know that the original sculpture that was housed in the Mahabodhi temple disappeared sometime after 1234. That's the last existing early record of it, when it was seen and recorded by the Tibetan monk Dharmash Vaman. And he describes it as it's later depicted in other replications. But here I want to focus instead briefly on the sculpture itself, which has now been reestablished in the latest reconstruction. You see it in the center photograph. Before it was gilded, and this is really recent, and over on the right side in its present gilded form. And on the left, I wanted to show you the image from the Pagan Mahabodhi temple, dating to around the 13th century, which has been constantly renewed over and over again so that it is always in a constantly fresh, present state, right? So it's not an aging image, but it's always with us at this moment. And here's just a clearer photograph of this reconstructed image now. Now, we know that the image itself was of great interest to Chinese Buddhists from the Tang Dynasty forward. We have in a very interesting article by a scholar named Choi Suna on the auspicious Bodhi image, or Puti Reixiang, a very fascinating image that dates to between 710 and 712 from the 10,000 Buddha cliff in Guangyuan in Sichuan province. So this comes from the very far west. It has a lengthy inscription which inscribes it as it basically says it's the eulogy of the Puti Reixiang, or the Puti or Bodhi, this kind of wisdom, enlightened wisdom, Reixiang, or this auspicious image of the Botan temple, which was donated by a man named Duke, or entitled Duke B, the then governor of Lizhou of the Great Tang Dynasty. We also know that Xuanzang, in noting the Mahabodhi image, was very clear about its status, because as you see in this particular image, it's wearing a crown and it's wearing jewelry in a way that really parallels what we saw with the Udayana sandalwood auspicious image in its later incarnations. So Xuanzang actually says, since there was not enough clay, people prepared and decorated the unfinished parts with precious jewels. So these were added on as gifts indicating reverence, essentially. And what we see here, presumably, is an image, then, of an image that's been treated to the appropriate veneration through the offering of jewels and been dressed properly and is being properly cared for. So it then emerges as a kind of, in the argument that Choi presents, as an auspicious image, one that is able to act in the world. However, in the Tang Dynasty also, there are any number of plaques, and this is something we heard about from Dorothy Wang last fall, plaques that are made in clay around the same time that the Empress Wu Zetian received a copy of an image of the Buddha from the Mahabodhi temple from the monk I Ching, who went to India around that time. And that image was established in the Fosha monastery. But then right after this, immediately in fact, there's this proliferation of these small plaques, of which there are dozens easily findable, that are all inscribed as good karma images, and that end with the declaration that these are, if you press these out of clay, you will achieve the Junru, or the true likeness, the wondrous form body of the Buddha. So we have a real sense here that we're looking at the real thing if we look at this image. And as you see here, the image is not shown as crowned. It's shown instead in a more canonical form of the Buddha that is completely unadorned. So the question of how we're supposed to understand this, I think, is an interesting one. And again, I turn to the famous images painting from Dunhuang to conclude, from the 8th century, again, where we're told that this is the famous image from Magadha, and we understand this to be Bodh Gaya, where we see it completely covered with jewels. It's got a crown, it's got a wonderful necklace and bracelets and so on. So it matches, in other words, in this period, right around the same time, the so-called Puti Reixiang from the 10,000 Buddhist cliff. So there are clearly two understandings of this image. One in which we're given to believe that we're looking at the true thing, and the other where we're given to believe that we're looking at the image of the true thing. I would suggest that this is a kind of ontological shift, or a shift in understanding the being nature of this, the nature and being of these images, that was fundamentally important, and that really argues for a growing sense of concern about the distance in time and space between China and India. And just to say, we've seen the same exact problem emerging, I think, in the sandalwood Buddha woodblock print, where we see the image crowned, and in Lin Ching's own sandalwood Buddha, where here a Manchu man has come on pilgrimage to this temple specifically because it purports to offer some sort of revelation of the true image. So I'm going to end here, and thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you so much.